Thank you for joining the Change Within podcast. This is Gerard Uselli here, fourth episode and ongoing. And it's been such a journey to really get to know, collaborate, and hear people's perspective as far as how change has impacted the lives of so many. And one person that I have who is a very special guest of mine, his name is Andrew Olsen, a certified fundraising professional. Andrew, how are you doing today?
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. So, as somebody who has been a fundraising professional of about 9 years, I definitely understand the sense of what it's like to put yourself out there, whether you really want to or not. And I'm sure with that smile, you could definitely relate to what I'm saying on that one. So, I'm kind of curious because I like to pick people's brains on this. What were you like growing up?
Hmm. That's a great question. I was kind of the dorky, chubby kid in class, right? I didn't have a ton of friends, but I had a good, tight knit group of folks. I loved to play baseball. Um, I was a catcher for about a dozen years. I wouldn't say I was super popular or anything like that, but had a good time. Just hanging out with close friends and playing sports. That's who I was as a kid.
Absolutely. What was your favorite sport to play?
Oh, by far baseball. I mean, I played baseball and football, and took martial arts classes off and on as a kid, but baseball was number one for me.
Why do I feel like it's kind of like great minds think alike on this one? I used to play baseball. That was my favorite sport growing up myself. And then
What
I
what
did a little
position
bit of
did you play?
karate. What was that?
What position did you play?
I played right field primarily. And then I did a little bit of second base.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it's one of those things where for me, I wasn't the best baseball player, but it was kind of fun to get to know people's like perception, sportsmanship, and always amusing how the parents would usually take their games more seriously than the kids themselves.
I might have one time asked an umpire to throw a mom out of a off of a field for exactly that reason. So I totally get it. Yeah.
That's great. Oh my god. So like kind of in that sense of being active growing up, like how did your personality traits lead into fundraising? Like what do you think was your biggest sense of transpiration?
Yeah, I think, probably the thread throughout for me is all about relationships. I as a kid growing up and as a teen and even in college, I focus more on a small group of close friends and built deep relationships more so than trying to know everybody and network with everybody. It was really about like building that quality of relationship, and so I think that has helped me well as a fundraiser, um, because so much of what we do on a daily basis is about building those relationships and deepening those relationships. And even in my role, leading an organization that does direct response fundraising, which is more of a mass market kind of activity, it all comes back to how do we communicate the value of the relationship between the donor and the organization, regardless of whether I'm sitting down face to face with somebody or crafting a letter to them.
What's kind of like your favorite way to engage with people? Because of course the common perception is always to be in person, but was there ever like a sense of meeting people that kind of surprised you throughout the times as well?
Hmm. I'm so clouded because of the last 10 months. I feel like I've always been on video calls.
Right.
So it's really, really easy for me to jump on and have a Zoom call. Because of my podcast, I'm used to interviewing people over Zoom and having conversations. And it oftentimes to me feels like it's something I've been doing for a decade rather than just a year. Um, I love to just sit down and have a cup of coffee with somebody though.
There's nothing like that feeling as far as like how you really get to know people over time.
Yep.
You're able to really grasp a lot about somebody literally in a span of a half hour. And then let's say if you contrast that setting in meeting somebody just in another sense of social gathering, whether
Yep.
it's like a networking event or some sort of big special event, the sense of really building with people is so limited over time.
It is. And I pretty much hate big networking events. I feel like,
Vice versa.
people are their guard is up, and people come into those conversations hoping to accomplish something. Whereas, if I sit down with you and we're going to have a cup of coffee, the only thing I want to accomplish is building rapport and starting to learn about you, rather than giving my elevator pitch or all the other crap that comes along with what people perceive about big networking events.
Interesting you say that, because as far as really getting to know people within your audience, and I'm curious because I've done a lot of public speaking and presentations, what was one story that you feel like you've built like from the audience? Like, have you ever used like senses of the props like around you as far as building like a pitch or some sort of presentation?
Yeah, with a lot of the work that I do, I'm presenting to smaller groups typically. And so when I come into a room, I like to particularly like talking to boards, right? I do a lot of board presentations and board conversations. I like to have just a short conversation with every person, right? And then try to find a way to hang together 3 or 4 of those conversations, so that in the, whether it's a sales pitch or a client presentation where we're talking about results, we can be, I can use those as kind of landmarks in the conversation to make everybody feel like they were a part of each of those different discussions, and really bring the group together around whatever the common objective is.
Absolutely. And kind of getting to that perspective for you as well, as you've been doing this for over 20 years, what would you consider your first breakthrough to be?
Hmm. So I've been a fundraiser on both sides of the aisle, and what I mean by that is I've been a consultant for a really long time, but I also raised money inside a children's hospital, led the annual fund program at an organization. And I think the biggest breakthrough I had was actually when I was at the children's hospital. I had the benefit of coming in after following someone who had been my client, so I knew the inner workings of the organization really well, and was able within 6 months to come in and redesign the entire program and create about a 4,000% lift in the revenue for the hospital, the philanthropic revenue, within 1 year. And so anytime you have that scale of change, it all of a sudden opens many different opportunities for you that you don't have or you didn't have previously. So I think, even though that was kind of in the middle of my career, that was one of the biggest breakthroughs that I've seen.
Absolutely. And kind of getting into that perspective even more, like is just as far as how many fundraisers keep things to their lifestyle, do you can kind of consider it as a social type of therapy in your life? Do you feel like it's gotten you through like a lot of personal mishaps and circumstances along your way?
Yeah, so this is something that I didn't really start processing until I was mid-career, really. But I've always been drawn primarily to fundraising for social service causes, right? So I'm most passionate about working with homeless shelters, food banks and food pantries, the Salvation Army, organizations like that, and in part because I grew up and experienced poverty myself. My family lost everything we owned and ended up homeless when I was about 15. So that the work that I do today is largely grounded in my desire to ensure that other families don't have to live through that, right? And so I feel like every day that I raise one more dollar for one of those causes is like, paying back the people who helped us get back on our feet and become, contributing members of society when I was a kid.
Kind of a follow up on that too.
Sure.
So, as I've worked for several organizations myself, I've always found it fascinating to distinguish the impact of a dollar as you're talking to your donors. What do you think is one thing from any of the organizations you worked with that stands out as far as like $1 here makes this difference to a community at large? Like, was there anything like within your pitching that has stood out to you in that regard?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any like one organization whose pitch stands out the most, but I think, I would say the more concrete you can make it, the better. And what we see day in and day out is, You know, a lot of organizations struggle with that. So they talk about, you know, your gift today is going to provide hope. And hope is nice, but hope doesn't solve problems, right? So, you know, I just got off of a call with one of my clients feeding Westchester. They're a food bank in Westchester County, New York.
Yeah.
And, you know, for them, $1 provides 3 meals, right? So when I sit down and talk to you and I say, well, wait a minute, can you make this investment to help the hungry in your community? And I'm able to make a concrete pitch like that. That's a lot easier for someone to get motivated by than saying your gift today is going to provide hope to hungry people.
Absolutely, you know? Because you're going to need some sense of tangibility behind what you're pitching to somebody.
Exactly. Well, and particularly because, you know, the donors we're talking to today, everybody thinks that the competition is between one charity and another. And there is some of that, but the competition really is between, do I spend this dollar on a charitable initiative, or do I download another movie from iTunes, or do I go to Amazon and get that other product that I wanted? And those are very concrete decisions that also come with very concrete benefits to the consumer. So if we're not developing offers and asks that are as concrete in their upfront and also in the benefits that they provide, we're going to lose.
Yeah, that's definitely the easiest way to form an uphill battle as far as not being prepared with how you can persuade people to be engaged with what you're willing to advocate for.
Yeah. You know, I think just if I can add one more,
yeah, sure.
I do a lot of work with rescue missions and ministries that are trying to transform people's lives out of addiction and homelessness and poverty. And, you know, some of the most effective asks in those areas would be things like saying, you know, to a donor, your gift of $1,000 today, or your gift of $500 today will allow us to take someone through a recovery process, get them off of drugs or alcohol, provide safe shelter, food, counseling, and all those other things for a period of 30 days or for a period of 2 weeks. I mean, so, you know, that's the level of like concreteness that really motivates donors.
Absolutely. And within that sense as well, I'm sure with especially your experience, traveling is an essential even before COVID, with many different experiences and what you've gained from each trip that you've done. Was there ever like a fun story that you've had that you've kind of like cherished throughout your career? It's like, wow, I feel like this only happened if I went on this trip.
Yeah. So you nailed it. I mean, I used to travel 6 days a week. For work. So I've spent a ton of time in hotels, on airplanes, trains, planes, automobiles. And one of my favorite stories, it wasn't so fun at the time, but it's one of my favorite stories. I was in Boston and I was there to visit the Greater Boston Food Bank, and I'm pretty cheap. So I picked the hotel that was the cheapest when I looked at the, you know, different options. That hotel happened to be right across the street from the trauma center, the ER in Boston, where all the like gunshot patients come, right? And next door to it is a methadone clinic. I didn't know that the first time I stayed there. So I walked outside to get a bite to eat, and 3 heavily intoxicated guys accosted me within 5 minutes. You know, and I'm wearing a suit, tie, like I looked the part of some guy who should have a bunch of cash, right? And so these guys all came around me and they started like patting my body, looking for my wallet and anything else of value. And I just thought to myself, like, crap, I'm going to get mugged right here on the street, right? And all I wanted to do was go out and get some Chinese food. And so luckily, a 4th guy came over and he was so intoxicated that he stumbled into all of us and knocked a couple of them to the point where I could just get out and run, right? And I ran, I don't know, 2 blocks or something back to the hotel. And as I got in the hotel, out of breath, I said to the woman behind the counter, like, you didn't tell me that this was such a bad neighborhood when you told me that there was a restaurant down the street. And she said, what, are you insane? This is Boston. You shouldn't go out over there. She said, I thought you were going to get a taxi, you know? So nowadays I can laugh about it. And I think it's actually kind of a hilarious story. But it was a little scary the first time.
So kind of to bounce off your story a little bit, I was pretty much the on assistant for my supervisor at the time. I'm no longer with this organization anymore, though, but this was about maybe 8 months before, unfortunately, due to COVID, I was let go from the circumstances to be. But when I was on this trip in Detroit, I was doing this special event that had over 300 people. It was for Variety Children's Charity. And my supervisor, I was trying to get us back from the actual event itself to the restaurant that we were about to go to. So we had a reservation allotted. And even though I'm not the best at directions, I felt when I was doing like my directions and giving my Uber driver like where to go within like the pinpoint of the event, I'm like, oh wow, I feel like everything's gonna work out. Little did I know that the Uber driver was delaying us about 20 minutes. And when it's December, 35 degrees out, and knowing that the cold is inevitable, you feel like 20 minutes is about 20 hours at that point. So, of course, trying to calm both parties down, which I ended up doing, thankfully. But we finally got into the Uber, and I felt like I was on a James Bond mission for literally 20 minutes.
Yep.
Absolutely. And kind of going from there. Oh, so what I was curious about is, especially with your podcast, you probably get like a lot of insight from different fundraising professionals. What's been one of your favorite books to read since the pandemic last year?
Yeah, so I've read 3 books since then. I'm in the middle of a 4th right now. The first one is Philanthropy Revolution by my good friend Lisa Greer. If you haven't talked to her yet, you should definitely have her on the show. She is a philanthropist. She comes out of the Hollywood entertainment talent community, and she's also an entrepreneur. She's built a number of companies. Her husband built a very successful company, and she wrote this book that's essentially an unmasking of the solicitation process and her experience as a high net worth donor with organizations that have solicited their support. And it's a fascinating read, and it's something I recommend to anybody in our industry. The other ones I had her on my show earlier in the year in 2020. Becoming a Leader of Impact by Braden Douglas is another really good leadership book that I was able to read last year. And then the third one is called Forged in Crisis, which it's written by Nancy Keene. She's a Harvard Business School professor. I actually got an opportunity to study under her a number of years ago. And it's a compilation of, I think, 4 different stories from history of major crises and what she learned researching how the leaders of those during those crises all responded to them and what the outcomes were. So those are 3 really good books that I had a chance to read in the last year.
That's very good. Do you feel like there was kind of a trait that you've enhanced more of, even if you've understood it like previously? Do you feel like it kind of enhanced the way you actually have done your fundraising work since?
I think each one of those books I've gleaned value from that I've been able to use in day to day, right? So with Philanthropy Revolution, a lot of what Lisa talks about in how she was engaged by charities, I've been able to translate into helping my team understand how high net worth donors want to be communicated with and the kind of experiences and engagement that they prefer, that I think has been helpful for our clients. Forged in Crisis was just perfect timing because it's all about leading through difficult times. And I think there's probably not been a more difficult time in our lifetimes than what we've gone through in the last 10 months. So a lot of how to keep people encouraged and motivated and moving forward in the midst of crisis. I was able to take a lot from that book about that. And on Becoming a Leader of Impact, that's really about how to develop personal leadership characteristics and traits. And so I feel like I've been able to leverage some of that learning to improve how I engage with my team.
Sure. And kind of going back to a little bit of like your personal development and growing up, were there ever like leaders in your life that you've always looked to? I'm not even going to really say mentorship in this case, but I guess people, whether it's in a pop culture lens, people that are like, wow, there's something that's very interesting about these individuals that make me want to do myself better.
Hmm. Yeah. So if we're talking about like pop culture icons, I will say I don't put a lot of stock in folks like that. Uh, Growing up, I had the opportunity to meet and be mentored briefly by a gentleman named Mike Sosha, which if you're a baseball aficionado, you'll know he was a catcher for the LA Dodgers and then went on to become a manager of theirs, and I think of the Angels maybe. Um, and what he taught me was all about resilience, right? And no matter how hard you get knocked down, always get back up. And that, that I've carried with me since I was a kid. More recently, I think, the people that I look up to most are people that that I've worked in the industry with, right? So I've got a great friend. He's the CEO of a company called ViewSpark. His name's Jeff Cleaver, and everything that I know about selling and about building relationships with people, I learned early on in my career from Jeff. So I think it's for me, it's more people like that.
Great. And as far as in the virtual world of doing your job, and I'm curious about this in the sense of doing events, what has been like one component that you feel like you haven't taken advantage of as much in selling like sponsorships and engagement opportunities that you felt like you were able to really take advantage of now?
Yeah, so excuse me. Full disclosure, I've not done a lot of event fundraising. That's an area that I just hadn't spent a lot of time in. Although early on with COVID, I helped one of my then clients, an organization called Eckerd Connects. They're in about 20 states. They serve kids in foster care. They provide adoption services. They have a huge workforce development program. And my really good friend Roy Jones, who's a co-author of one of my books and contributed to another, and he's a co-host on our podcast, Rainmaking. He's their chief development officer. So he called me early on and said, look, 85% of our revenue comes from events. With this COVID thing, we have to pivot, right? So this is less about what I did, more about what he did. He really brilliantly started engaging a couple of different organizations to do online concerts. And people kept saying, well, nobody's going to want to sit through a concert. Nobody's going to want to, do that. It's not going to be interesting. And what he kept saying was the individuals who come are the cherry on top. This is an opportunity for us to maintain and grow sponsorship revenue because we can say we're delivering eyeballs to our corporate partners, right? And so in their first initiative, I don't remember the exact number, but I think probably they raised something like $30,000 in corporate sponsorships, right? Which they would, if they had just shut down their events, they wouldn't have had anything. And that was even more than they had planned to be able to raise from the physical event that they were planning, And so since then, I believe he's gone on to do an event a month virtually, and really as a means to maintaining and growing sponsorship by providing digital engagement for those corporations. So, I think that's the kind of engagement that I've seen most recently. I know of a couple other organizations that have leaned into virtual reality to do, actually sending their donors cardboard VR goggles and producing virtual reality video content to bring donors into the field with them, in their overseas missions and things like that. I think that's very interesting.
Oh, that's very cool. I never heard of that before, like it utilizing that spectrum. So that's a really cool like discovery.
Yep.
And as far as talking to different organizations myself, and alongside just asking this question to people, I'm always very interested in the answers I've received in this. And for you, I'm curious, what's the most creative way you've ever thanked somebody? And it could be for yourself personally or with an organization that you worked with in a sense of stewardship.
So years ago, I worked with an organization, excuse me, and what they did was, this is the children's hospital I worked at. and they're a pediatric subspecialty hospital that really focuses on traumatic brain injury and disability care for kids that have things like spina bifida or cerebral palsy and different things like that. They make their own prosthetics, right? And so I think the most unique thank you thing that we did was we had a donor who provided a significant contribution to support that area of their work. And so we brought him and his child in, and they spent a day in the prosthetics lab with the designers and guys doing manufacturing and creating really unique, colorful, whimsical prosthetics for some of the kids that were going to be receiving them. So that's, kind of a totally off the wall. It's not the typical. It's certainly not just a thank you note. It's not a bouquet of flowers or candy or anything like that. It was really getting them into the mission of the organization, into what they were excited to fund, and letting them kind of get their hands dirty in the process.
Well, think of it this way. For the example you provided, there's like that sense of graciousness, especially in a sense of prosthetics for the children who unfortunately go through these circumstances. There's always going to be that remembrance based on what they've had attached to them moving forward. So
Exactly.
the sense of them recollecting as far as who's there for them, it's not even just a sense of being grateful. That's not really the point. It's more of the point of having a family connection of the people who are willing to be there for them.
It was. And, the family connection piece actually is really important, because what that donor said after the fact was he felt like it was really meaningful, but not just because we allowed him to be a part of the process, but that we allowed him to bring his child along with him as well.
Very nice.
So it was sort of like he saw it as an opportunity to teach his child about philanthropy at the same time.
That's a very cool way to go out on that one. And I guess my last point, even though you kind of said one example already,
Sure.
But what would you advise people who are in a similar field compared to what we do, as far as keeping themselves at practice and at their best in the fundraising and nonprofit field?
Yeah. So if you are not a frontline fundraiser, I would encourage you to pair up with a frontline fundraiser and go on as many donor visits as you can. There is no better way to learn our business and how donors think and how challenging the work actually is than sitting down and going through that process. And I would say the other thing is take every opportunity that you can get to knowledge share with other fundraisers in the community.
Absolutely. So in that regard, that wraps up episode 4 for the Change Within podcast. For those who can't find this, you can now find this on Anchor, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at the Change Within podcast. Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really glad to have you as a guest.
Awesome, man. Thanks a lot. Grateful that you asked me to be part of this. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You as well.
Bye-bye.